What's up, y'all? So today we're going to be talking about how to draw orbital diagrams, and I will be giving you guys the tips and tricks you need to be able to complete them quickly and efficiently. I will include a blank copy of this worksheet down below, and I will also include the answer key down in the description. Alright, y'all, so we're going to first look at these two periodic tables so that we can start to understand the tips and tricks better before we get into an example. So let's go. So any element that falls under these two columns, including helium. For this, you can just imagine helium being right here. Their highest orbital will be an s orbital. Any elements in these 6 columns, excluding helium, their highest orbital will be p orbitals. Now for this next periodic table, any elements that fall under this row will have a shell of 1. Any elements that fall under this row will have a 2 shell, 3 shell, and etc. And what that really means is the number in front of the letter, and by letter I mean p or s. So like up here we were talking about p orbitals and s orbitals. For example, 2p, that means that it would be in the 2 shell, or 3p, or we can have 1s, we can have 2s, 3s, and so forth. So let's get into an example to really practice this. Alright guys, so for our first example, we're going to be using nitrogen. So what we want to do first is go up to the periodic table and find it on the periodic table. So nitrogen is located right there. Our next step is going to be to start from the top and work our way down in rows until we reach our element. So let me show you what that looks like. So first, this first row, and remember we can imagine helium being right there, is going to be 1s. So let's go ahead and annotate that in our orbital diagram. 1s. Our next row is going to be right here, 2s. So let's go ahead and put that on the orbital diagram again, 2s. Our next row right here, 2p. So now let's put that in, 2p, 1, 2, 3. And if you look in the 2p category, we hit nitrogen, which means that we can stop. Now, an important thing to, pick up here is that the s orbitals will always go in this column right here. Then the p orbitals will always go in this column right here. Another thing to pick up on is that p orbitals, when we're talking about a p subshell, there will be 3 p orbitals. When we're talking about s subshells, there will only be 1 orbital in each s subshell. So the next step is going to be to identify how many electrons nitrogen has. So if we just zoom in on the periodic table, we can look at the atomic number, and that will tell us how many electrons we have to work with. So nitrogen has 7 electrons. So let's go and take a note of that. 7 electrons. And let's get to work. So when filling these electrons into the s orbitals, we need to make sure that we completely fill an s orbital before moving on to the next. So let's do that. 1 electron, 2 electrons. 1 orbital can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. So we know that this orbital is now filled and we can move on to the next. Now we have 3 electrons, 4 electrons. Now we can move on to our next orbitals, right? And that's in the 2p subshell. So we can have 1. And based on what I just said, you might think that we do this. 2, then 3. However, in p orbitals, with p orbitals and p subshells, the electrons like to spread out as much as possible before doubling up. So let me show you what that would look like. So far we have 5 electrons, so we have 2 more that we can place. So the 6th electron will go right there, and the 7th electron will go right there. And this is what the orbital diagram will look like for nitrogen. Now let's get into our next example. Alright, so for our next example, we're going to be using fluorine. So the first step, let's find fluorine on the periodic table, which is found right here. Now we're going to work from the top all the way down in our rows until we hit the element in question. So let's get started. This row right here, remember, we're going to think of helium being right here, is going to be 1s. So let's go fill that in. It's going to be our 1s subshell. Then we got these 2 elements right here. This is going to be our 2s subshell. 2s. Then we got these 6 elements right here, which are going to be our 2p subshell. And since we hit fluorine right there, we know we can stop right here in our 2p. Fluorine is right here, so we know let's stop and let's fill in our orbital diagram. So fluorine has 9 electrons, and we know that by looking at the atomic number. So let's take the note, 9 electrons, and let's start filling in our orbital diagram. So for the s orbitals, let's fill each one in. 2 electrons, 2 electrons, so that's a total of 4 right now. So right now we have 5 more to work with. So remember, with p orbitals and p subshells, we have to fill out the electrons, we have to spread them out as much as possible before doubling up. So 5, 6, 7, then we can come back and double up. 8 and 9. And this is what the orbital diagram will look like for fluorine. Alright guys, so for our next example, we're going to have sodium. Now, the first step, let's find sodium on a periodic table. Then, we're going to work our way from the top all the way down in our rows until we reach our element. So let's get started. Remember, we have our 1s. Then we have our 2s. Then we have our 2p. 1, 2, 3, 2p. And then we have our 3s. And we hit sodium, so we know we can stop. 3s. So let's check out how many electrons sodium has. Sodium has 11 electrons, and we know that from the atomic number. So let's take a note of that and get to work filling in our electrons. 11 electrons. So the first step, let's fill in our s orbitals fully and then move on. 1, 2, let's move on to the 2s orbital. 3, 4, then let's move on to our p subshell. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We have 1 electron left, and that's going to go into the 3s subshell. So this is what the orbital diagram will look like for sodium. Alright guys, so for our next example, we'll be doing argon. Now, let's find argon on the periodic table. Argon is found right here. Now, our next step, we're going to work our way from the top all the way down in our rows until we hit argon on the periodic table. So let's get started. First, we have 1s. So let's go fill that in. 1s. And then we have our 2s. 2s. Then we have our 2p row. 2p. 2p. 1, 2, 3. Then we have our 3s. 3s. Oh, 3s. And then we have our 3p. And since we hit argon, we know we can stop. 3p. 1, 2, and 3. So let's find out how many electrons argon has. Argon has a total of 18 electrons. So let's take note of that and get to work. 18 electrons. So let's fill in our s orbitals, then move up slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So this is what the orbital diagram will look like for argon. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And remember, there will be a blank copy and an answer key of this worksheet down in the description.